In the shadowed archives of St. Augustine Seminary in rural Pennsylvania, there exists a photograph that no one speaks of. Standing before an altar that would become their tomb are 12 young men in pristine white vestments, their faces radiant with faith. The date inscribed on the back reads May 15, 1847, the day these seminarians were to be ordained as priests. Their first Mass was never said by a single one of them. After that photograph was taken, not one of them was ever seen alive again. For over a century and 70 years, the Catholic Church has maintained that the entire ordination class of 1847 perished in a tragic fire that consumed the seminary's east wing. But a different story is told by the charred remains of the building. It is a story of 13 sets of footprints leading into the chapel basement and only a single set leading out. Claiming structural damage, the church sealed the basement permanently in 1848. Since then, they have never allowed anyone inside. What really happened to those 12 young priests remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in American Catholic history, buried beneath deliberate misdirection and layers of official silence. Before we continue with the story of what the church has hidden for nearly 2 centuries, understand that this channel isn't for everyone. It is only for the bravest souls, those who dare to uncover the truth behind history's darkest mysteries. If you possess the courage to face what others fear to know, subscribe now and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Together, let's discover what really happened to those 12 souls who vanished on the night they were meant to serve God. But to understand the true horror of what occurred at St. Augustine Seminary, we must first journey back to a time when fear and faith walked hand in hand through the Pennsylvania wilderness. The small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was found in the year 1847, nestled in the rolling hills 40 miles west of Philadelphia, a community of barely 300 souls bound together by unwavering Catholic faith and shared struggle. Founded by Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine, Millbrook existed as a pocket of Catholicism in a predominantly Protestant region where anti-Catholic sentiment ran as deep as the mountain streams that fed their modest farms. On the town's eastern edge stood St. Augustine Seminary like a fortress of faith. Above the surrounding countryside, its imposing Gothic stone walls rose 3 stories. Built in 1823 by Bishop Francis Kenrich himself, the seminary served as the training ground for priests destined to serve the growing Catholic population across Pennsylvania's frontier. Of permanence and divine purpose spoke the building's architecture. Soaring arched windows, thick limestone walls, and a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the valley. Far beyond Pennsylvania's borders extended the seminary's reputation. Young men from across the eastern United States came to study under the guidance of Father Superior Marcus Whitmore, a brilliant theologian who had trained at the prestigious seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. From his seminarians, Father Whitmore demanded absolute dedication, believing that only through complete surrender to God's will could a man become worthy of the priesthood. His methods were rigorous, some whispered harsh, but they produced priests of exceptional discipline and faith. The cream of American Catholic youth was represented by the class of 1847, 12 young men aged between 22 and 28, who had completed their 6 years of study with distinction. In the seminary's Golden Book, their names were inscribed. From Boston, Michael O'Brien; from Baltimore, Thomas Kellerman; from New York, Patrick Murphy; from Philadelphia, James Fitzgerald, and 8 others whose families had sacrificed everything to see their sons serve God. Among them stood out Francis Benedetto, the son of Italian immigrants who had settled in Pittsburgh. At 24, Francis possessed an intellectual brilliance that impressed even Father Whitmore. 5 languages he spoke fluently, vast portions of scripture he had memorized, and he demonstrated a theological understanding that seemed to transcend his years. As their natural leader, his fellow seminarians looked to him, and many believed he would one day become a bishop. In Spartan cells on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, the seminarians lived, rising each morning at 4 for Lauds, followed by Mass, meditation, breakfast, and 8 hours of study. At 9, their days ended with Compline, after which the great silence began. No word was to be spoken until the following morning's prayers. For 6 years, this rhythm had governed their lives, preparing them for the sacred responsibility of shepherding souls. But in the weeks leading up to their ordination, something had begun to change within the seminary's walls. In whispers, the seminarians spoke of strange dreams that visited them nightly, visions of a 13th figure dressed in black vestments standing at the altar during their future ordination ceremony. The figure's face they described as obscured by shadow, but its presence filled them with an inexplicable attraction and a mixture of terror. Their increasing restlessness had been noticed by Father Whitmore. During their final examinations, several seminarians had given answers that troubled him deeply. About the nature of sacrifice, when asked, Francis Benedetto had spoken not of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but of the greater sacrifice that opens the door to true understanding. About obedience, when questioned, Thomas Kellerman had replied that obedience to God sometimes requires disobedience to man. Their own concerns to Father Whitmore had been expressed by the other faculty members, Father Jonathan Mills, Father David Brennan, and Father Peter Kowalski. At unusual hours, the seminarians had been discovered in the chapel, kneeling in prayer formation around a circle drawn in ash on the floor. When confronted, they claimed to have no memory of how they came to be there. Always the same was their explanation. By a voice that spoke in their dreams, they had been called to pray. As May 15th approached, the entire town of Millbrook prepared for the ordination ceremony. It would be the largest such event in the region's history, with Bishop Kendrick himself traveling from Philadelphia to perform the sacred ritual. From across the eastern seaboard, families had already begun arriving, filling the town's modest inns and staying with local families who opened their homes to the visitors. 10 o'clock in the morning, the ceremony was scheduled, to be followed by a grand celebration that would last until evening. Their final vows would be spoken by the seminarians, they would receive the sacred oils of ordination, and they would transform from students into priests empowered to celebrate Mass, hear confessions, and guide souls to salvation. It was to be the culmination of their years of preparation, the moment when their lives would be forever consecrated to God's service. But on the night of May 14th, as the seminarians knelt for their final evening of prayer before ordination, none of them could have imagined that they were about to become part of a mystery that would haunt the Catholic Church for generations to come. The evening of May 14th, 1847, began like any other in the life of St. Augustine Seminary. Their final examinations had been completed by the seminarians, and they spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, preparing their souls for the sacred transformation that awaited them with the dawn. As darkness settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, the familiar rhythm of Compline echoed through the stone corridors, marking the beginning of what should have been their last night as students. With particular solemnity, Father Whitmore conducted the evening prayers, his voice carrying extra weight as he blessed the 12 young men who would soon join the ranks of the priesthood. Lit by dozens of candles, the seminary's chapel cast dancing shadows across the ancient stones as the seminarians knelt in their usual formation. But something unsettling was noted by those who observed them closely. Not on the altar, but on some invisible point in the air above it, their eyes seemed fixed. At precisely 9 o'clock, the great silence began. In their customary order, the seminarians filed out of the chapel, the only sound in the vast building their soft footfalls on the stone floor. Father Whitmore watched them go, noting how Francis Benedetto paused at the chapel door and glanced back with an expression that seemed almost expectant. The course of St. Augustine Seminary's history would be forever changed by what happened next. The seminary's elderly porter, Brother Thomas Aquinas, was making his final rounds when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. From deep within the building came the resonant tones of the chapel's great bell, tolling not the customary pattern of the hours, but a slow, measured cadence that seemed to pulse with its own dark rhythm. 12 tolls, then a pause, then 12 more. 3 times the pattern repeated before falling silent. By heart, Brother Thomas knew the bell schedule. No bell was supposed to ring during the great silence. More disturbing still, each night the bell tower was locked, and Father Whitmore kept the only key. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze voice of the seminary's own bell calling out across the sleeping valley. As Brother Thomas hurried toward the bell tower, he encountered Father Mills emerging from his quarters, his face pale with concern. "Brother, did you hear?" Father Mills began, but his words were cut short by another sound that sent ice through both men's veins. From the chapel came the sound of chanting, not the familiar Latin of their daily prayers, but something older, more primal. Unmistakably those of the seminarians were the voices, but the words they spoke seemed to come from no Christian liturgy. In waves, the chanting rose and fell, punctuated by responses that echoed strangely in the stone chamber. With mounting dread, Father Mills and Brother Thomas approached the chapel doors. The massive oak portals, which had stood open during evening prayers, were now sealed shut. When Father Mills pressed his ear to the wood, he could hear the seminarians' voices clearly, but the words they spoke seemed to shift and change, even as he listened, as if the very air was transforming the sounds. At the end of the corridor, Father Whitmore appeared, moving with urgent purpose. In his hand, he carried a ring of keys, his face set in grim determination. "The bell tower is locked," he announced grimly. No one rang that bell from above. Before the chapel doors, the three men stood, the chanting continuing beyond the thick oak barriers. From his ring, Father Whitmore selected a large iron key, the master key that opened every door in the seminary. But when he inserted it into the lock, it would not turn. The mechanism, which had functioned perfectly for over 20 years, seemed to have frozen solid. "Get Father Brennan and Father Kowalski," Father Whitmore ordered Brother Thomas. "Something is very wrong here." As Brother Thomas hurried away, the chanting within the chapel began to change. More insistent, the voices grew louder, and underneath them both priests could hear another sound, footsteps descending what sounded like stone steps. But the chapel had no stairs. Throughout, the floor was level, with only the raised altar at the far end. Within minutes, Father Brennan and Father Kowalski arrived, their faces reflecting the same mixture of concern and bewilderment that gripped their colleagues. Together, the four priests worked to open the chapel doors, but no amount of effort could budge the ancient locks. It was as if the doors had been sealed from within by some force beyond their understanding. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to press against their ears like a physical weight. To the seminarians, Father Whitmore called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the corridor. No response came. For the next hour, the priests attempted to breach the chapel doors, but their efforts proved futile. Finally, Father Whitmore made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We'll have to go around," he announced. The sacristy door connects to the chapel from the outside. Through the seminary's corridors, the 5 men, the 4 priests and Brother Thomas, made their way to the external door that led to the sacristy. This smaller entrance, used primarily for storing vestments and sacred vessels, provided direct access to the chapel's interior. In this lock, Father Whitmore's key worked smoothly, and the door swung open without resistance. Every expectation was defied by what they found inside, and every assumption about what was possible within the sacred walls of St. Augustine Seminary was challenged. The chapel was empty. Not merely vacant, but impossibly, completely empty. The 12 seminarians who had been chanting only moments before had vanished without a trace. Across the floor, their prayer books lay scattered, pages torn and scattered like autumn leaves. The candles that had illuminated their evening prayers had been extinguished, leaving only the cold smell of recently snuffed wax. But it was the altar that truly shook the priests to their core. The massive stone structure, which had stood unchanged for over 20 years, had been moved, not shifted slightly, but completely relocated to reveal a gaping hole in the floor beneath, a hole that descended into darkness so complete that their lamplight could not penetrate its depths. With trembling steps, Father Whitmore approached the opening. Perfectly circular was the hole, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, with stone steps carved into its walls, spiraling downward into the earth. Far older than the seminary itself was the stonework, and covered with symbols that none of the priests recognized. A strange, sweet scent was carried by the air that rose from the depths, which seemed to cling to their nostrils and make their heads spin. "This is impossible," Father Brennan whispered, his voice barely audible. On solid ground, the chapel was built. The foundation records show no basement, no crypt, nothing. Beside the opening, Father Kowalski knelt, holding his lamp as far down as he dared. "The steps go down at least 20 feet, he reported. "I can see more symbols carved into the walls, but I can't make out where they lead." As the priests debated what to do next, a discovery was made by Brother Thomas that would prove crucial to understanding the night's events. Near the altar, partially hidden beneath a scattered prayer book, he found a folded piece of paper. The parchment was old, its edges yellowed with age, and the handwriting upon it was in a hand none of them recognized. Aloud, Father Whitmore read the document, his voice growing more strained with each word. To those who seek the truth beyond the veil of mortal understanding, know that the path to true enlightenment requires sacrifice beyond what the weak-hearted can comprehend. Of their own will, the 12 who descend this night do so, called by voices that speak from depths older than any church, older than any faith built by human hands. A purpose higher than any earthly ordination can provide, they go to serve. In the world above, seek them not, for they have chosen to serve in the world below. For others to follow, their sacrifice opens the door. The 13th witness remains to tell their tale. The document was unsigned, but the implications were clear and terrifying. Not against their will had the seminarians been taken. Willingly into the depths beneath the chapel they had gone. But who or what had called them there, and who was the 13th witness mentioned in the note? Carefully, Father Whitmore folded the parchment and placed it in his vestment pocket. "We must search the opening," he announced, though his voice betrayed his reluctance. "If there's any chance they're still alive." But before any of them could make the descent, a new sound echoed from the depths below. The sound of stone grinding against stone, as if massive blocks were shifting into place. In horror, the priests watched as the opening began to close, the stone steps disappearing section by section as some mechanism sealed the passage from below. Within minutes, the hole was completely covered by what appeared to be solid stone floor. Somehow, the altar had moved back into its original position, and the chapel looked exactly as it had before the night's events began. If not for the scattered prayer books and the lingering sweet scent in the air, the priests might have believed they had experienced some shared delusion. But the seminarians were gone. 12 young men who had been preparing for ordination had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would torment St. Augustine's Seminary for generations to come. Over the Pennsylvania countryside, as dawn broke, the bells of St. Augustine's Seminary remained silent. That day, there would be no ordination ceremony, no celebration of new priests joining the ranks of the faithful. Instead, there would be only the beginning of a cover-up that would span more than a century and 70 years. That a tragic fire had claimed the lives of all 12 seminarians during the night was told to the families and guests who had traveled from across the eastern seaboard to witness the ordination. Indeed, the east wing of the seminary was set ablaze later that morning, destroying any evidence of the night's true events. That the young men had been trapped in their dormitory and overcome by smoke, their bodies consumed by the flames, would be shown by official records. But those who knew the truth, the 4 priests and Brother Thomas, would carry the weight of that night's events for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed something that challenged every foundation of their faith, something that suggested the existence of purposes and forces beyond the scope of Christian understanding. And somewhere in the depths beneath St. Augustine's Seminary, in chambers that predated the arrival of Christianity in the New World, 12 young men who had once prepared to serve God were beginning their service to something far more demanding and far older than any earthly church. Exactly 3 days lasted the official investigation into the fire at St. Augustine's Seminary. Within hours of the reported tragedy, church officials from Philadelphia arrived. Their black carriages creating a solemn procession through the streets of Millbrook. They examined the charred remains of the East Wing, took statements from the surviving faculty, and issued their final report with an efficiency that seemed almost rehearsed. That a lamp had been knocked over in one of the dormitory rooms, igniting the building's aged wooden fixtures, was concluded by the report. By smoke and flames, the seminarians had been trapped. So completely consumed were their bodies that no remains could be recovered. An accident was ruled the tragedy, the result of negligence during the young men's final night of preparation. But Father Whitmore and his colleagues knew the truth was infinitely more disturbing and far more complex. Dramatically, the seminary's atmosphere changed in the weeks following the fire. In hushed tones, the remaining students, those in their earlier years of study, spoke about dreams that visited them nightly. They reported seeing 12 figures in white vestments walking the corridors after midnight, always moving toward the chapel, but never arriving. The same way the dreams always ended, with the sound of stone grinding against stone and a voice calling from depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical world. His own visions began to be experienced by Father Whitmore. Each night as he knelt for his private prayers, he would see Francis Benedetto standing at the altar of the chapel, his face serene, but his eyes reflecting a knowledge that seemed to transcend human understanding. Toward the floor where the opening had appeared, the apparition would gesture, and Father Whitmore would hear, not with his ears, but with his mind, the words, "The door remains open for those who truly seek." A source of constant unease became the chapel itself. During daily mass, the priests would notice that the altar seemed to shift slightly, as if the stone beneath it was settling. At random times, usually during moments of particular solemnity, the sweet scent that had risen from the depths would return. Several times, brothers and faculty members reported hearing faint chanting echoing from the chapel during the night hours, always in that same unknown language the seminarians had spoken. Brother Thomas, whose porter duties required him to make rounds throughout the building, began to document strange occurrences with obsessive detail. His private journal, which would later be discovered in the seminary archives, recorded phenomena that defied rational explanation: footsteps in empty corridors, doors that opened and closed without cause, and most disturbing of all, the periodic appearance of 13 shadows in the chapel when only 12 candles were lit. With unsettling frequency throughout the seminary, the number 13 began to appear. Instead of the traditional 14, students would count 13 stations of the cross. On the altar, 13 candles would appear despite careful inventory showing only 12. Most disturbing of all, 13 places would sometimes be set in the refectory, though only 12 people were expected for meals. A discovery was made by Father Mills, who had served as the seminary's librarian for over 15 years, that shed new light on the night's events. While cataloguing books in the theological section, he found a volume that had not been there before, a leather-bound manuscript written in Latin with extensive annotations in what appeared to be Francis Benedetto's handwriting. De Mysteris Antiquis, on Ancient Mysteries, was the book titled, containing detailed descriptions of pre-Christian religious practices that had supposedly been practiced by indigenous peoples long before European settlement. That certain sacred sites retained spiritual power that could be accessed through specific rituals and sacrifices was suggested by the text. Most chilling of all, the manuscript included architectural diagrams that showed underground chambers beneath religious buildings, chambers designed to facilitate contact with entities that existed beyond the physical world. To Father Whitmore, Father Mills brought the book, who examined it with growing horror. That the young seminarian had been studying these ancient practices for months, possibly years, was revealed by the annotations in Francis Benedetto's hand. That he had come to believe that true spiritual enlightenment required embracing powers and knowledge that the Christian Church had deliberately suppressed was suggested by his notes. More disturbing still were the personal letters that Father Mills discovered hidden within the book's pages, written by Francis to his fellow seminarians. A growing conviction that their ordination was not an end but a beginning, a preparation for a far greater service than the Catholic Church could offer, was revealed by the letters. Of the old ways and the true path to divine understanding spoke the letters, suggesting that for months, the seminarians had been planning their descent into the depths. A passage that made Father Whitmore's blood run cold was contained in the final letter, dated just 3 days before the ordination ceremony. The 13 who serve below have waited centuries for successors. We 12 have been chosen to join them, to become the bridge between the world of light and the world of shadow. Our earthly ordination would bind us to serve man's limited understanding of God. Our true ordination will bind us to serve forces that shaped the world before man drew breath. As winter settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, the surrounding community began to be affected by the strange events at St. Augustine Seminary. That their livestock refused to graze in fields that faced the seminary was reported by local farmers, and several families claimed that their children had begun speaking in their sleep, using words that sounded like the ancient language heard in the chapel. An unusual number of cases involving disturbing dreams and night terrors among Millbrook's residents was documented by the town's physician, Dr. Samuel Richardson. Identical visions were reported by his patients. His private notes described 12 young men in white vestments descending stone steps, followed by a 13th figure whose face remained shrouded in shadow. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the change in Father Whitmore himself. The priest, who had once been known for his unwavering faith and intellectual rigor, began to exhibit signs of profound spiritual distress. Alone in the chapel, he would spend hours, kneeling on the spot where the opening had appeared, his lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, but which those who listened closely recognized as repetition of the same ancient syllables the seminarians had chanted. Growing increasingly concerned about his superior's mental state, Father Brennan began to keep his own secret journal. A man struggling to reconcile his faith with experiences that challenged every theological foundation he had ever accepted was revealed by his entries. Of finding Father Whitmore in the chapel at impossible hours, apparently deep in conversation with invisible presences, he wrote. Most disturbing of all, he recorded that Father Whitmore had begun to refer to himself as the 13th witness, the same title mentioned in the mysterious note found after the seminarian's disappearance. As the first anniversary of the tragic fire approached, the seminary's enrollment had dwindled to fewer than 20 students. Families who had once considered it an honor to send their sons to St. Augustine now avoided the institution entirely. Throughout the Catholic communities of Pennsylvania, rumors spread about the cursed seminary where young men disappeared and strange voices echoed through the night. The possibility of closing St. Augustine Seminary permanently began to be discussed by church officials in Philadelphia. A liability had become the building, a source of scandal and supernatural speculation that threatened to undermine the church's authority in the region. But before any final decision could be made, an event occurred that would forever change the course of the seminary's history and reveal the true extent of the horror that had taken root beneath its foundations. The event began with a letter that arrived at the seminary on the morning of May 14, 1848, exactly 1 year after the seminarian's disappearance. No return address was borne by the envelope, and the handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar to any of the faculty. With trembling hands, Father Whitmore opened it, his face growing pale as he read the contents aloud to his assembled colleagues. The letter that arrived on that grey May morning contained only a few lines, but their implications would shatter whatever remained of the seminary's peace. To the faithful servants of St. Augustine Seminary, the year of preparation is complete. Once more tonight, the door beneath the sacred altar opens. The 13th witness must choose. Remain in the world of light and watch your flock scatter like leaves before the wind, or descend to join those who serve the deeper truth. Yours has the choice always been, Marcus. The 12 who wait below call your name in voices that carry the weight of centuries. Come to us freely, or watch your life's work crumble to dust. The letter was unsigned, but Father Whitmore recognized the handwriting. It was Francis Benedetto's elegant script, unchanged despite a year beneath the earth. Father Brennan, who had been watching his superior with growing concern, saw the color drain from Father Whitmore's face as he read the letter. Marcus, he said softly, using his friend's Christian name for the first time in years. What does it say? Father Whitmore's response came in a voice barely above a whisper. They're calling me home. The other priests demanded to see the letter, but with desperate intensity, Father Whitmore clutched it to his chest. His eyes, which had once burned with intellectual fervor, now held the glazed look of a man who had stared too long into an abyss that had finally begun to stare back. As evening approached, a change in the building's atmosphere was noticed by the seminary's remaining students and faculty. With an energy that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive, the stone walls seemed to pulse. Every corridor was now permeated by the sweet scent that had appeared intermittently throughout the year, growing stronger with each passing hour. His final letter that afternoon was written by Father Kowalski, who had been documenting the seminary's decline in his private correspondence with church officials in Philadelphia. In it, he described Father Whitmore's deteriorating condition and his growing conviction that something ancient and malevolent had taken root beneath the seminary's foundations. He ended the letter with a warning that the situation was spiraling beyond their control and a request for immediate assistance. As darkness fell over the Pennsylvania countryside, the familiar routine of evening prayers took on an ominous quality. With visible nervousness, the remaining students, fewer than 20 young men who had chosen to stay despite the seminary's reputation, knelt in the chapel. They could feel the building's anticipation, as if the very stones were waiting for some momentous event. With an intensity that bordered on desperation, Father Whitmore conducted the prayers. His voice, usually calm and measured, rose and fell with emotional peaks that made the students exchange worried glances. When he reached the final blessing, His hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the prayer book. After the students had been dismissed to their dormitories, the 4 remaining priests gathered in Father Whitmore's study. The room, which had once served as a sanctuary of theological learning, now felt like a tomb. Across the floor, books lay scattered, their pages torn and scattered. The walls, once lined with centuries of religious scholarship, now displayed only empty shelves and faded rectangles where paintings had hung. "Marcus," Father Mills said gently, "you need to leave this place. Whatever happened here, whatever is still happening, it's destroying you." Father Whitmore turned to face his colleagues, and they saw in his eyes a depth of knowledge that no mortal man should possess. "You don't understand," he said, his voice carrying an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the building. "They didn't disappear. They were chosen. They were called to serve something greater than any of us can comprehend. Listen to yourself," Father Brennan pleaded. "You're talking about abandoning everything we've sworn to uphold our vows, our faith, our responsibility to these students." "Our responsibility?" Father Whitmore laughed, a sound that sent ice through his colleagues' veins. "We've been teaching them to serve a diminished God. A God constrained by human understanding and limited by human fears. What lies beneath this chapel predates Christianity by millennia. It was old when the first human beings learned to speak. The seminarians who descended understood this truth. As Father Whitmore spoke, the priests became aware of a new sound echoing through the building. From somewhere below their feet came the rhythmic pounding of stone against stone, as if massive blocks were being moved by unseen hands. Stronger and more insistent grew the sound, creating a vibration that could be felt in their bones. "They're preparing," Father Whitmore announced with certainty. "The door will open again tonight, and this time it will remain open. The 13 who serve below will finally have their witness in the world above." Abruptly, Father Kowalski stood, his face pale with determination. "I'm going to the chapel. If there's some kind of opening down there, if there's any chance those boys are still alive." "Not alive," Father Whitmore interrupted. "Not in any sense that you would understand. They've been transformed, elevated, given purpose beyond the petty concerns of earthly existence. Tonight, I join them." Louder, more insistent grew the pounding from below. From the ceiling, dust began to fall as the entire building shook with each impact. The remaining students in their dormitories could be heard by the priests, their voices raised in confused alarm as their beds rattled against the walls. A decision that would save his life but haunt his dreams for decades to come was made by Father Mills. "We need to evacuate the building," he announced. "Get the students out, send word to Philadelphia, and seal this place permanently." But Father Whitmore was already moving toward the door, his steps purposeful and determined. "You can try to stop what's happening," he said over his shoulder, "but you cannot change what has already begun. The door opens tonight, and the 13th witness takes his place among the chosen." Through the corridors of the seminary, the 3 priests followed Father Whitmore, their footsteps echoing off stone walls that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. From their dormitories, students emerged, their faces reflecting the terror that had gripped the entire building. With each step they took toward the chapel, the air itself seemed to thicken. As they approached the chapel doors, light emanating from beneath the heavy oak barriers could be seen by the priests. Not the warm glow of candles, but a cold, blue radiance that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Into a complex rhythm had evolved the pounding from below, like a heartbeat that originated from the very foundations of the building. On the chapel door, Father Whitmore placed his hand, and it swung open without resistance. Into their memories for the rest of their lives would be burned the sight that greeted them. Once again, the chapel's floor had opened, revealing the spiral staircase that descended into the earth. But this time, the opening was larger, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, and the blue light that rose from its depths cast everything in an otherworldly glow. Around the opening's edge stood the 12 missing seminarians, their white vestments now gleaming with that same cold radiance. But no longer were they the young men who had disappeared a year ago. An ageless quality had been taken on by their faces, their eyes reflecting knowledge that seemed to span centuries. With perfect synchronization, they moved, their gestures forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. "Marcus," they said in unison, their combined voices creating harmonics that made the chapel's stone walls ring like bells. "The circle is almost complete. Take your place among us, and the work can truly begin." In the center of the circle, rising from the depths of the opening, stood a figure that made the priests' minds recoil from comprehension. Tall it was, and draped in robes that seemed to be cut from the darkness itself. Where its face should have been, there was only a void that seemed to pull at their sanity like a physical force. The 13th witness, the figure spoke, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The one who will carry our message to the world above. The bridge between what was and what will be." Forward stepped Father Whitmore, his face radiant with an expression that combined ecstasy and terror in equal measure. "I understand now," he said, his voice carrying the same impossible harmonics as the seminarians. "I've been chosen to serve a purpose greater than any earthly church could provide." As he approached the opening, the true horror of what they were witnessing was finally understood by the 3 remaining priests. This was not merely about the disappearance of 12 young men. It was about the transformation of human souls into something utterly foreign to God's creation. Not killed had the seminarians been. They had been recruited into service of entities that existed in the spaces between light and shadow, beings that predated human civilization and sought to reclaim dominion over the world above. Driven by a desperate courage that surprised even himself, Father Brennan lunged forward to stop his superior. But with inhuman speed moved the seminarians, their hands grasping him with strength that seemed to flow from the earth itself. As they held him, he could feel something pressing against his mind, alien thoughts that sought to overwhelm his consciousness with visions of cosmic truth and universal insignificance. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Francis Benedetto said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The door has been opened, and those who serve below have been patient for far too long. The 13th witness will ensure that our message reaches every corner of the world above." As the remaining priests realized the full scope of what they were facing, the struggle in the chapel intensified. This was not a simple case of religious apostasy or even demonic possession. It was something infinitely more dangerous and far more ancient. According to laws that predated human understanding operated the entities that had claimed the seminarians, and their patience was finally exhausted. Drawing upon reserves of faith he didn't know he possessed, Father Kowalski began to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin. The words seemed to cause the blue light to flicker and dim, and for a moment the seminarians' perfect synchronization faltered. Its attention to him was turned by the tall figure in the center of the circle, and Father Kowalski felt his mind being probed by something vast and utterly alien. "Your prayers have no power here," the figure spoke, its voice creating harmonics that made the chapel stones groan. "Long before your carpenter God walked among men, this place was sacred. Older truths, older powers, the earth itself remembers. In the face of an eternal darkness, your faith is a flickering candle." But his prayer was continued by Father Kowalski, his voice growing stronger with each word. Their combined voices creating a barrier of sacred sound that seemed to hold the transformed seminarians at bay. The other priests joined him. For a moment, it appeared that their faith might be enough to break whatever hold the entities had over Father Whitmore. Then a single word in the ancient language was spoken by Francis Benedetto, and the very air in the chapel seemed to solidify. As an invisible force pressed against their lungs, making each breath a struggle, the priests' voices died in their throats. Intensified the blue light from the opening, casting their shadows in impossible directions that seemed to move independently of their bodies. At the edge of the opening, standing, Father Whitmore turned to face his colleagues one final time. The same ageless quality as the seminarians had been taken on by his face, but his eyes still held a flicker of the man they had known for so many years. "Tell them," he said, his voice barely recognizable as human. "Tell them that we found what we were truly seeking. Tell them that the door between worlds has been opened, and soon others will follow the path we have chosen." Against the pressure that seemed to crush his chest, fighting, Father Mills managed to gasp out a single word. "Marcus, please." But already descending the stone steps was Father Whitmore, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared into the blue radiance. Their movements creating patterns that hurt to observe directly, the seminarians began to follow. As each one disappeared into the depths, The pressure in the chapel grew stronger, threatening to drive the remaining priests to their knees. What might have been arms was raised by the tall figure in the center, and the opening began to expand. As the circle of blue light grew wider, threatening to encompass the entire chapel, the stone floor cracked and shifted. With growing horror, the priests realized that the entities below were not merely claiming individual souls. They were attempting to breach the barrier between their realm and the world above. Still held by the inhuman strength of the seminarians, Father Brennan felt his consciousness beginning to fragment under the assault of alien thoughts. Visions of vast underground cities populated by beings that had ruled the earth before humanity learned to stand upright, he saw. Ceremonies conducted in caverns that extended to the planet's core, rituals designed to tear holes in reality itself, he witnessed. Most terrifying of all, he saw the future they were working toward, a world where the boundaries between dimensions had been permanently shattered, where creatures of shadow walked freely among men. Just when it seemed that the priest's sanity would be completely overwhelmed, an unexpected salvation arrived. Into the chapel burst Brother Thomas, who had been awakening the students and preparing them for evacuation, carrying a large wooden cross that had hung in the seminary's main corridor for over 20 years. The cross had been carved from wood taken from a tree that allegedly grew on the site where St. Patrick had converted the Irish to Christianity. The moment Brother Thomas crossed the chapel's threshold, the blue light flickered and dimmed, loosened the seminarians' hold on Father Brennan, and the crushing pressure in the air began to ease. With a power that predated even the entities below, the ancient wood of the cross seemed to resonate, drawing upon centuries of faith and devotion that had been invested in its carved surface. The old wood remembers older truths, Brother Thomas said, his voice carrying surprising authority. This tree was sacred before Christianity came to Ireland, and it remembers the bargains that were made when the first missionaries arrived. Light and shadow agreed to coexist, each in their proper realm. Its attention to Brother Thomas was turned by the tall figure, and the porter felt his mind being probed by something vast and ancient. But a barrier that the entity could not penetrate seemed to be created by the cross in his hands, providing protection. "You speak of bargains made in darkness," the figure said, its voice carrying notes of grudging respect. "But those agreements did not account for willing servants. These 12 came to us freely, offering their souls in exchange for knowledge. The 13th seals the compact, opening the door for others to follow." Deceived they were, Brother Thomas replied, holding the cross higher. Shown visions of cosmic truth when they were really being prepared for slavery. "The door you seek to open will bring only darkness to the world above." Suddenly stopped the seminarians who had been moving toward the opening with mechanical precision. For the first time since their transformation, their faces showed individual expressions, confusion, doubt, and what might have been remembered humanity. When he spoke, Francis Benedetto's voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. We chose this path," he said. But his words lacked the absolute conviction they had held moments before. "We sought truth beyond the limitations of earthly faith. Escape from the responsibilities of serving others, you sought," Brother Thomas countered. "True faith requires sacrifice, but not the abandonment of those who depend on your guidance. Look around you. See what your choice has brought to this place of learning and prayer." Toward the chapel doors looked the seminarians, where the remaining students could be seen huddled in the corridor. Terror and confusion were reflected in their young faces as they witnessed the cosmic horror unfolding in what should have been their sanctuary. Several were weeping, their faith shattered by events that no theological education had prepared them to understand. For a moment the blue light from the opening flickered, as if the entities below were experiencing something they had not anticipated, doubt among their chosen servants. From Brother Thomas to the seminarians turned the tall figure's attention, and when it spoke, its voice carried notes of anger and urgent command. "The compact is sealed," it declared. "The willing sacrifice has been accepted. The door will not close until the 13th takes his place among the chosen." But from the depths of the opening rose Father Whitmore's voice, and for the first time in months, it sounded entirely human. I can see what this leads to," he called, his words echoing strangely off the stone walls. "The visions they showed us, they were incomplete. This path leads not to enlightenment, but to the destruction of everything we swore to protect." Toward the opening turned the seminarians, their perfect synchronization broken by their superior's words. Closer to the edge stepped Francis Benedetto, his face reflecting a struggle between the alien influence that had claimed him and the remnants of his humanity. "Marcus," he called down into the depths. "What do you see? What truth have they hidden from us?" In a voice cracked with horror and regret came Father Whitmore's response. "I see the world they want to create. Cities of shadow where humans serve as cattle for beings that feed on faith itself. Churches transformed into breeding grounds for entities that mock everything sacred. The door they want to open. It will never close. We won't be serving a higher purpose. We'll be midwives to apocalypse." Its arms were raised by the tall figure, and with renewed intensity, the opening began to pulse. A reddish tinge was taken on by the blue light that cast everything in the chapel in the color of blood. When it spoke, its voice carried the promise of cosmic revenge and the weight of eons. "The 13th witness has seen too much," it declared. "The compact will be completed whether he serves willingly or not. The door will open, and the reign of shadow will begin." Worm began to feel the cross in his hands by Brother Thomas, as if responding to the entity's threat. A soft, golden light that pushed back against the blue radiance rising from the depths began to be emitted by the carved wood. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of every prayer that had ever been offered in the chapel's sacred space. "Not while faith endures," he declared. "Not while there are those willing to stand against the darkness." The battle for the souls of the seminarians and the fate of the world above was about to reach its climax. Into chaos erupted the chapel as the forces of light and shadow clashed in a conflict that transcended physical reality. The golden radiance from Brother Thomas's cross met the red-tinged blue light from the opening, creating a barrier of pure energy that split the chapel down its center. On one side stood the 3 surviving priests and the porter, their faith blazing like a beacon in the cosmic darkness. On the other, between their alien masters and their remembered humanity, wavered the transformed seminarians. What might have been arms was raised by the tall figure in the center of the opening, and the very stones of the chapel began to shift and change. Upward until they seemed to touch a sky that no longer resembled anything terrestrial, the walls elongated. A window into depths that hurt to perceive directly became the ceiling, showing vistas of underground cities populated by beings that had never known sunlight. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the entity declared, its voice now coming from every stone in the building. "The compact has been sealed with willing sacrifice. The door between worlds stands open, and the reign of shadow approaches." But with desperate urgency from the depths rose Father Whitmore's voice. "Francis, all of you, remember why you came here. Remember the vows you prepared to take. We sought to serve something greater than ourselves. But not this, never this." Closer to the opening stepped Francis Benedetto, his face a battlefield between alien influence and human memory. We studied the ancient texts. We sought truth beyond the limitations of doctrine. The entities below promised us knowledge, understanding of cosmic mysteries. Slavery disguised as enlightenment, they promised us," Father Whitmore interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "I can see their true purpose now. They don't want servants. They want anchors. Human souls to tie their realm to ours. Every person who descends these steps makes it easier for them to manifest in the world above." At each other looked the remaining seminarians, with expressions that reflected their internal struggle. As their human consciousness fought to reassert itself, the alien influence that had claimed them flickered like a guttering candle. First spoke Thomas Kellerman, his voice shaking with the effort of independent thought. "The dreams they sent us. Were they lies?" "Not lies," came a new voice from the depths, one of the seminarians who had descended the previous year. "But incomplete truths. They showed us the glory of cosmic knowledge while hiding the price. We are no longer human, no longer capable of the love and compassion that drew us to serve God. We have become echoes of ourselves, hollow vessels for alien will." To the depths turned the tall figure's attention, and when it spoke, its voice carried notes of urgent command. "Silence. The compact is sealed. The chosen serve willingly." But continued the voice from below. "We serve because we have no choice. The moment we descended these steps, Our free will was forfeit. Don't let them claim you, Francis. Don't let them claim any more souls to their eternal darkness. Warmer felt the cross in his hands by Brother Thomas, its golden light intensifying until it illuminated every corner of the chapel. A barrier that held the entity's influence at bay seemed to be created by the sacred wood, resonating with power drawn from centuries of faithful prayer. Still yours is the choice, he called to the seminarians. Your souls haven't been fully claimed yet. You can still choose to serve the light instead of the darkness. At his fellow seminarians looked Francis Benedetto, seeing in their faces the same struggle he felt in his own heart. The alien influence that had seemed so compelling in the months leading up to their ordination now felt like chains made of shadow, binding them to purposes that mocked everything they had once held sacred. What about Father Whitmore? He asked. What about those who have already descended? Before Brother Thomas could respond, spoke the tall figure. Theirs are they eternally. The compact cannot be broken. Regardless of what you choose, the door will remain open. But with surprising strength from the depths rose Father Whitmore's voice. On deception was the compact based. Of the consequences, we were not fully informed. By the laws they themselves follow, incomplete knowledge invalidates consent. Sharply toward the opening turned the entity's attention, and for the first time, its absolute confidence seemed to waver. When it spoke, its voice carried notes of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Willingly descended the chosen. Beyond mortal understanding, they sought knowledge and power. To serve God, we sought, Father Whitmore replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. When we discovered that your offer required abandoning that service, we had already been changed beyond our ability to refuse. That is not willing consent, that is entrapment. As competing forces of cosmic law clashed within its walls, the chapel began to shake. Between the blue radiance that marked the entity's realm and something else flickered the opening in the floor, a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, older and deeper than the alien influence. What was happening was understood by Brother Thomas. According to cosmic laws that governed all supernatural interactions operated the entities. If about the nature of their consent Father Whitmore was correct, then indeed the compact could be challenged. But from those who had been most directly affected had to come the challenge, the seminarians themselves. Francis, he called urgently, you and your classmates have to choose, but this time with full knowledge of what that choice means. Will you serve entities that want to use you as anchors for invasion? Or will you serve the God who called you to protect and guide his people? One final time looked around the chapel Francis Benedetto, seeing it not as the transformed nightmare it had become, but as the place where he had spent 6 years preparing to dedicate his life to service. The alien influence that had seemed so compelling now revealed itself as the trap it had always been, a promise of cosmic knowledge that came at the price of everything that made existence meaningful. I choose, he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. I choose to serve the light, not the darkness. I choose to protect the innocent, not enable their destruction. I choose, he paused, looking directly at the tall figure that had claimed so many souls. I choose to reject your compact and everything it represents. One by one, the same choice was made by the other seminarians, their voices joining in a declaration that created harmonics of pure human will. As the alien influence lost its hold on their souls, the blue light from the opening began to flicker and dim. In apparent rage raised its arms the tall figure, and under the force of cosmic displeasure, the chapel's walls began to crack. The compact cannot be broken, it declared. The door will remain open. Others will follow the path you have rejected. But forward stepped Brother Thomas, the cross in his hands blazing with golden radiance that pushed back the darkness. The compact is broken, he declared with absolute authority. The chosen have withdrawn their consent with full knowledge of the consequences. By your own laws, they are free. Began to change the opening in the chapel floor. Something far older and more powerful giving way to the blue radiance. From the depths came not the alien presence that had claimed so many souls, but the voice of the earth itself, ancient, patient, and infinitely compassionate. The door between realms will be sealed, the voice declared in words that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. The compact is indeed broken. Their humanity restored, Those who descended under false pretenses will be given the choice to return. Began to fade the tall figure, its form becoming translucent as its connection to the world above was severed. As it disappeared, its final words echoed through the chapel with the promise of future threat. The door may be sealed, but others will find ways to open it. The reign of shadow is inevitable. We are patient. We will wait. But fainter grew its voice with each word until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the warm golden light that filled every corner of the chapel. From the opening came the sound of footsteps on stone stairs. Not the mechanical procession of the transformed, but the hesitant steps of human beings choosing to return to the light. First emerged Father Whitmore, his face bearing the marks of his ordeal, but his eyes clear and human once more. Behind him came the 12 seminarians who had descended the previous year, their white vestments no longer gleaming with alien radiance, but simply the cloth of young men who had faced ultimate darkness and chosen to reject it. Like a blessing after the longest night in the institution's history broke the dawn of May 15, 1848, over St. Augustine Seminary. The chapel, which had been a battleground between cosmic forces just hours before, now appeared exactly as it had for over 20 years. Solid stone was the floor, with no trace of the opening that had led to realms of shadow. In its proper place stood the altar, unmarked by the supernatural forces that had moved it. Any indication of the momentous events that had transpired was given only by the lingering scent of something indefinably clean and pure. Before the altar knelt Father Whitmore, his hands clasped in prayer that came from the depths of a soul that had journeyed to the edge of damnation and found its way back to grace. Beside him knelt the 12 seminarians who had been lost for an entire year, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of sorrow and gratitude that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed them utterly. At the chapel's entrance stood Brother Thomas, still holding the carved cross that had proven to be their salvation. To its normal appearance had returned the ancient wood, but he could feel the power that resided within it, not alien or otherworldly, but deeply, fundamentally human. It was the accumulated faith of centuries, the prayers of countless souls who had sought guidance and comfort in their darkest hours. In the corridor beyond huddled the students who had witnessed the night's events. Confusion and fear that would take years to fully process were reflected in their young faces. They had seen their faith tested in ways that no theological education could have prepared them for. But they had also seen that faith triumph over forces that sought to destroy and corrupt it. Around their superior gathered Father Mills, Father Brennan, and Father Kowalski, their relief evident in every gesture. They had watched Father Whitmore walk voluntarily into damnation, and now they could hardly believe that he stood among them once more, his faith stronger than ever and his humanity restored. How do we explain this? Father Brennan asked quietly. How do we tell the church hierarchy what really happened here? From his prayers looked up Father Whitmore, his eyes clear and purposeful. The truth we tell them, he said simply. All of it. The entities that sought to use our seminary as an anchor point for invasion. The seminarians who were deceived into believing they were serving a higher purpose. The cosmic laws that govern supernatural contracts, everything. And if they don't believe us? Father Kowalski asked. Then the evidence will show them, Father Whitmore replied, gesturing toward a leather-bound journal that lay on the altar. When the seminarians emerged from the depths, the book had appeared, its pages filled with detailed accounts of their experiences in the realm below. Everything they saw and experienced has been documented by Francis and his classmates. The underground cities, the entities that rule there, the cosmic laws that govern their interactions with our world. There it's all. Since his return from the depths, Francis Benedetto, who had been silent, finally spoke. What they wanted to do to our world, we saw, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. The entities below don't seek to destroy humanity outright. They want to transform it, to make us willing servants in a cosmic order that denies everything sacred and beautiful about existence. Visions of the future they were working toward, they showed us, added Thomas Kellerman. Cities where humans lived in constant fear, where faith itself had been corrupted into a tool of oppression and despair. Instead of gods, they wanted to use our seminary as a template, a place where future priests would be trained to serve their purposes. Carefully on a nearby pew sat the cross Brother Thomas and approached the group of priests and seminarians. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Do we close the seminary and pretend none of this happened? Do we relocate and start fresh somewhere else? Or do we stay and ensure that what happened here never happens again? Stood Father Whitmore, his decision already made. We stay, he declared. This place has been tested by forces that sought to corrupt it, and it has emerged stronger. Because it sits on ground that was sacred long before Christianity arrived in the New World, the entities below chose this location. When our faith alone might not have been enough, that sacredness protected us. But the students, Father Mills protested. Their families will never trust us again. The reputation of this place, through our actions, will be rebuilt, Father Whitmore interrupted. More careful about who we accept as seminarians, we'll be. The warning signs that led to Francis and his classmates being vulnerable to alien influence, we'll study. Not just theology and doctrine, but how to recognize and resist supernatural threats that seek to corrupt the church from within, will teach future priests. At his former superior looked Francis Benedetto with something approaching awe. You want us to stay after what we did, what we almost caused? Deceived you were, Father Whitmore replied gently. Shown partial truths and led to believe that abandoning your earthly responsibilities would lead to greater service. Masters of manipulation are the entities below, able to make the darkest choices seem like acts of divine inspiration. Your mistake was in believing that true faith requires abandoning the world instead of serving it. By the sound of carriages approaching the seminary was interrupted the conversation. Through the chapel windows, they could see a procession of black vehicles making their way up the hill. Church officials from Philadelphia, no doubt responding to Father Kowalski's urgent letters. In the Francis Benedetto, whose intellectual brilliance had made him a target for the entities below, devoted himself to creating a comprehensive guide for recognizing alien influence. Throughout the Catholic world, his work would eventually be distributed to seminaries, helping to prevent future incidents like the one that had nearly destroyed St. Augustine. To Father Thomas was elevated Brother Thomas and placed in charge of the seminary's new Department of Supernatural Defense. In a place of honor was enshrined the carved cross that had saved them all, its power serving as both protection and reminder of the faith that had triumphed over cosmic darkness. As the years passed, as the most secure religious institution in the United States developed a reputation by St. Augustine Seminary. Throughout Catholic communities spread stories about the priests who had faced ultimate darkness and emerged with their faith stronger than ever. Young men who felt called to defend the church against supernatural threats applied to study there, creating a new generation of clergy equipped to handle threats that ordinary theological education could never address. As the seminary superior continued to serve Father Whitmore until his death in 1889. The door remains sealed, but vigilance is eternal. Tell them never to forget what we learned. That faith without knowledge is vulnerability, and knowledge without faith is corruption, were his final words, according to Father Benedetto, who was present at his bedside. No longer empty remained the basement beneath the chapel, but it was sealed. With blessed concrete had filled it church architects and installed a series of monitoring devices that would detect any attempt to reopen the passage to the depths. For over 50 years showed no unusual activity. The readings from these devices, checked daily by members of the Department of Supernatural Defense. But in 1899, exactly 52 years after the original incident, something that made Father Benedetto, now the seminary superior, call for immediate assistance from Rome was detected by the monitors. Not an attempt to reopen the passage showed the reading, but something far more disturbing, a message transmitted through cosmic frequencies that no earthly technology should have been able to detect. Brief but chilling was the message. The compact may be broken, but the work continues. Others have learned from your resistance. New doors will be opened in places where vigilance has grown weak. The reign of shadow approaches through paths you have not considered. To the creation of a global network of institutions dedicated to monitoring and countering supernatural threats to religious organizations led this discovery. Throughout the Catholic Church and beyond spread the lessons learned at St. Augustine Seminary, creating an invisible army of defenders who stood guard against forces that sought to corrupt faith itself. Today, more than a century and 70 years after the events of 1847, on its hill in Pennsylvania still stands St. Augustine Seminary. A theological college that trains priests in traditional doctrine is housed in the building, but it also serves as the headquarters for an organization that few people know exists, the Collegium Defensorum Fidei, the College of Faith's Defenders. For daily mass and special ceremonies remains in use the chapel where cosmic forces once clashed. Unaware that they are standing on ground where human faith once triumphed over alien corruption, visitors often comment on the sense of peace that pervades the space. A simple inscription that few people notice is borne by the altar beneath which lay the door to otherworldly realms. Faith tested in fire burns brighter. Both warning and inspiration for those called to defend faith against supernatural threats serves the story of the 12 seminarians who descended into darkness and returned to light. It reminds us that the greatest dangers to religious institutions come not from external persecution, but from internal corruption, from those who would use trusted positions and sacred spaces to serve purposes that mock everything religion is meant to protect. But it also reminds us that faith, when properly understood and courageously applied, has the power to triumph over any darkness. Forces older than human civilization were represented by the entities that sought to claim St. Augustine's seminary, armed with knowledge that spanned cosmic ages. Yet they were defeated by the simple courage of ordinary men who chose to serve light instead of shadow, truth instead of deception, love instead of power. To this day remains sealed the basement beneath St. Augustine Seminary. By technology that bridges the gap between science and faith are monitored its concrete barriers. That the door to the depths remains permanently closed is suggested by the readings showing no unusual activity. But know those who work in the Department of Supernatural Defense that vigilance is the price of spiritual freedom, and that new ways to corrupt and claim human souls are always being sought by the forces of darkness. In the end, a reminder that faith is not passive acceptance, but active resistance to everything that seeks to diminish or corrupt it serves the story of the priests who never said their first Mass. The 12 young men who were prepared to serve God in traditional ways instead became warriors in a cosmic battle that most people never realize is being fought. In a ceremony of pageantry and celebration did not come their ordination, but in the moment they chose to reject alien promises and return to the light that had called them in the first place. That the greatest threats to faith come not from those who openly oppose it, but from those who would corrupt it from within, transforming sacred institutions into tools of spiritual slavery, is shown to us by this mystery. Yet, it also demonstrates that faith, properly understood and courageously applied, possesses power that transcends any earthly understanding. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such cosmic battles between light and darkness continue in places where vigilance has grown weak? Below, leave your comment sharing your thoughts about faith, sacrifice, and the hidden defenders who stand guard against supernatural threats. If you enjoyed this tale of religious mystery and cosmic horror, subscribe now and hit the notification bell to never miss stories that explore the darkest corners of religious history. With someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge our understanding of faith and reality, share this video. Remember, only for those brave enough to face truths that others fear to acknowledge is this channel. In the next investigation into the mysteries that history has tried to forget, see you.